Okay, perfetto. Grazie. On behalf of the U.S.-Italy Forum, welcome to this special program in honor of International Women's Day on March 8th. The title is What Women Want, the realpolitik version, not the Hollywood version. We'll be discussing the role and the influence of women in the global arena. We've assembled a group of 4 women from 4 countries, all distinguished for their work in the international sphere as professors, lawyers, activists, and journalists. In alphabetical order, Nina Luzzatto Gardner is an American and an Italian. She's a lawyer and director of Strategy International, a corporate sustainability advisory firm. She's an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., and has been an activist on women's issues for many decades. Roya Ghafele is from Austria. She's the managing director of OxFirst, a law and economics consultancy specializing in intellectual property and competition. As of this year, she's also a visiting professor in intellectual property law and economics with Brunel University in London. She has a master's degree from SAIS. Nina Hall comes from New Zealand. She's an assistant professor in international relations at SAIS in Bologna. She previously worked as a lecturer at the Rete School of Governance in Berlin and as a policy officer at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Viviana Mazza is from Italy. She's an award-winning journalist with Corrente Rosa, and she writes often about the United States and the Middle East. She's written 10 books, and she's a member of the Fulbright Commission in Italy. She's not directly connected with SAIS, at least not yet. I'm your moderator, Claudia Flisi, a journalist, writer, and also a SAIS alumna. Our session will be an hour long, and the format will be approximately 5-minute presentations by each panelist based on their level or area of expertise, followed by cross-questioning, and if possible, other questions. So let's start with the American/Italian, Nina Gardner.
Thank you, Claudia. And it's just a delight to see such distinguished panelists, all women, and another Nina on the panel, always a good thing, pretty rare. What women want, the realpolitik version. From the US perspective, but of course, I think this is cross-cutting, I would say women want to be heard and taken seriously. I just want to remind everybody here that thanks to the 19th Amendment, women got the vote 50 years after the slaves got the vote, so in 1920. So just, to put everything in perspective. Women also now, thanks to women's suffrage, comprise a majority of citizens in most countries and in the US. And I think this, I don't know about other countries, so it would be interesting to hear. They have the highest voter participation. So in the last election, it was 63% vis-a-vis 59%. And we can go into breakdowns, ethnic breakdowns, et cetera. I would say Black women there's a 10% difference between Black women and Black men. And of course, more progressive, we can talk about that later too. I think they want to be valued for their competence. And I think usually more prepared and competent to get where they are anyway. I'm making gross generalizations, but in general, if you're going to throw yourself into the mischia, as they say, you better be good. I think women don't want BS, okay? They want to get down to problem solving. I think they're better in constructive leaders in general. They're more apt to cross party lines to get the job done. I also think women are less motivated by ego and resume building and more about making change. I think in general, when you hear interviews with Michelle Bachelet and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and other great leaders, they're generally more selfless and they just want to make change. I also think they have more long-term horizon because they're women, so more sensitive to issues about the environment, climate change, social justice, and human rights, judging from how many women students I've had over the 15 years of teaching business and human rights. It's usually 80% women, and I just wonder what that's all about. Very interesting. And also just because historically they've been an oppressed class, I think they're just more attuned to those kind of issues. But also as the main educators in their family, they have a stronger sense, I think, of right and wrong, bringing up kids and trying to make peace there. And there are studies out there which show less tolerance for corruption. And there's some interesting studies on how many more women are whistleblowers in general than men. So that's another sort of whole variant that we can talk about. Now you had asked us the question about women in politics. Should we think more gender and more competence? I don't think you have to make sort of a choice. I think we need to have more competent women in general, and they do have a different viewpoint. And I think there are issues that they care about more, which tend to be a greater eye for education, I would say healthcare very much, gender equality, and issues of domestic violence, those kind of issues, in addition to, as I said, environment and human rights in general. I would say also, we can discuss this, but I tend to think that women in power, they get their big chances when men have left messes. Okay, so they come to clean up, and unfortunately have to say that. I think of Theresa May first and foremost on that. And usually, because men are usually thinking of their resumes, they don't want to be set up for failure. So it's like, okay, Mikey, the woman can do it and go in and fix that. Again, gross generalization, but I think it's interesting. One of the most interesting phenomena that I saw in the last election in 2018 was a group of women that I've been following very closely called, this is sort of the moderate squad, not the AOC Rashid Tlaib squad, but this is the squad of women, 4 women who were elected from Republican districts. So they flipped their districts after 20 years of more than 20 years of Republican rule. And these are women who were sitting on, not on the sidelines, but they were serving their country, either in the military or in the CIA, who finally said, I cannot sit on the sidelines and let Trump, run rife with our foreign policy and our security. And they stepped up, had no idea, and that running for office was not what they had planned to do in their lives, but they just sono scese in campo, as they say. They said, enough, I need to do this. And that group is the most interesting group of all. And I'll name their names just because they're extraordinary. Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey, Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania, and Amy Spanberger from where I am now in Virginia, and Elaine Luria, also from Virginia, who got elected from Norfolk, where there's a huge Navy base. These women were extraordinarily useful in the first set of impeachment hearings, because they had real national security experience, and Amy Spanberger, particularly Russian expertise. And so they actually they penned a very important op-ed in the Washington Post in 2019, September 23rd, 2019, basically saying that they have dedicated their lives to service and the security of their country. And they really, were appalled by what they saw as their president selling us down the river. So I think this was interesting because it was shifting away from the usual education, women's rights, healthcare issues into defense and national security, where we haven't seen enough women, frankly. I expect we'll be seeing more, but these women really had the street cred, and nobody could say, oh, these women are soft on defense, because they had all, served their country. One was a Navy pilot and a Naval Academy graduate. The other one was, Air Force veteran. You could not. So we're seeing a lot more of those women who are coming in, they have competence, and it's not their goal in life to run for office and be in office, but they want to make a difference, and they come in when they see that there is a situation that needs to be dealt with. So I'll stop at that,
great.
and we can, go into a number of
Take
those
it
points.
from there. Okay, from the American Italian, let's go to the Italian. So Viviana, you want to take it from there?
Yes, hi. It's really nice to be with you all, and I look forward to the other contributions. As a journalist, I mostly cover the US and the Middle East, so I won't really talk about Italy much, but I wanted to start from Italy because I'm also an author of books for young adults. And recently, because I was asked to talk about gender and in schools, I actually, it was a Zoom call like this, right? And so I asked in advance the classes to prepare to talk about what they thought were prejudices about women, about girls, and about boys. These were middle school kids. And one interesting thing that came out from some of their answers is that some of the girls were reflecting not just on the prejudices that concern women and girls, but on those that concern boys. They were saying that they were talking about how, one of them wrote, her response, and she said that boys who wear certain clothes, boys who, are thinner and not muscular, boys that are not acting tough, are considered effeminate, are considered gays, are called gay and by their friends, and they kind of are and this is not just one girl, several of them were talking about the prejudices that affect boys rather than girls. They were also talking about the ones that have to do with girls, but it was interesting to me how they were looking at how a society that is structured along certain expectations for boys and girls, for men and women, actually is a problem for everybody. And I think that was the most interesting thing that came out from this experiment. And the other thing is that many of them said it's time to break the rules, whether or not the older generations want it or not. So they still project themselves as in opposition to myself, I guess, because I'm the older generation in this sense, even though, I'm there to talk about gender. So it was interesting to see that the obstacle is still, for middle school kids seen as, that generation. There was some reference to what we call the locker room talk. Boys are still allowed to talk in a different way compared to girls. One of them noticed how if boys, there are higher expectations from women. Women have to be perfect, whereas boys don't, and if boys are distracted, they're given more leeway than women, and they perceive that as something that is not fair. And I totally agree with that, because this is part of the problem, that the different expectations is part of the problem, I guess. Not because I want women to be mediocre and not reach the highest potential, but because I think that there is that in the society. But from that, I actually wanted to go also to the political sphere, as Nina did, because you, Claudia, asked us to reflect to the idea, does it make sense to encourage women to enter politics because of gender, or would it be more reasonable to encourage competence from any gender? And I do believe that we have to reach a level of parity. I don't think that I will ever agree with all the policies or all the ideas from other women. I don't think that we should agree with each other on everything, but I think that we should be given the same opportunities. And in Italy today, my newspaper Corriere della Sera published a study on 2 pages that showed how still there is an increased number of women in the private and public sector, in executive boards, especially if you look at the under 35, there has been an incredible increase, in compared to a few years ago. But the problem is still the top. We don't have women at the top. We have a lot of women, still, they're pushing, we are pushing, but still, there hasn't been quite a breakthrough. And the pay gap, there was this, there's this initiative now on a European level that Draghi is also supporting, that companies employing at least 250 people in the European Union will have to start providing data on gender pay gaps. And in Italy, we have a 4 to 5% gender pay gap, although if you look at the private sector, it's double what it is in the public sector. So, this is definitely something that women want. Also, and I don't want it, I could talk forever, but I just will add a very brief thing because I want to give space to everybody. But you talk about real politics in Hollywood. Actually, recently, as Kamala Harris was going to become the first vice president in the US, I looked a little bit at Hollywood, like rather than Hollywood's actually TV series, and how there has been in the last few years, we've seen a lot of women on top, we've seen a lot of women, powerful women, right, in the imagination. But what happens to these powerful women? There is a stereotype that is quite common. That is the stereotype of the bad boss. Claire Underwood in House of Cards, who's so cold and calculating as much as her husband is, if not sometimes more. And Selena Meyer in HBO, in Veep on HBO, was so selfish, but also incredibly inept. And Donald Trump, compared to her lack of, consideration, seems sometimes like, just learned from her. And there are these women who, broke the glass ceiling. They realized the feminist dream, but they don't act like feminists. They open the door and they closed it behind them with cynicism, with compromises. And there are this stereotype of the youngest and more idealistic women who actually are disappointed in them. But this is also a stereotype, I think, because interiorized sexism is not a problem just of one generation or another. I don't believe that older women are necessarily less idealistic than younger ones, despite what the kids think. I think that, I personally think that, how can I say it? Women in power are part of hierarchical institutions, traditional hierarchies. And we shouldn't expect them to be better than men in the same positions. We should expect everybody to be better, but not women to be better than men, which is something that girl in a school pointed out. And at the same time, younger women are not necessarily better feminists or better persons, but it's something that we should, I believe, work on. I believe that competence should be pointed out, but I do believe that we also have to strive for fairness.
Okay, on that note, thanks a lot. And then maybe in the questions we can get to some observations that relate also to your experience in the Middle East and how women fare there, with any contrasts if you care to draw them between Israel and other countries in the Middle East, because presumably there are some differences there, although I don't know on whom they reflect better or worse, but presumably there are differences. Okay, then in terms of geography, we're going now. So Roya Ghafele, who is Austrian but in the UK, so we're still staying in Europe. Then we'll get to New Zealand.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to present. I need to correct, I'm not a master's student. I didn't get a master's from SAIS. I did a postgraduate degree. I did it at the same time as my DPhil. I don't want to put feathers behind me, which I don't have.
Postgrad seems even better, but that's okay.
So no, I think initiatives like these are very, very important. And it's really crucial and instrumental. We keep reminding ourselves that gender remains a very, very central aspect of pretty much every area of life. I work in the high tech sector, and there are hardly any women in high tech. Silicon Valley is very young and very dynamic, but where are the girls?
Oh,
I don't see them. You know, I mean, I really live in a male-dominated area. Patents, technology, the ICT, IoT, artificial intelligence, all of these new ways of how we are disrupting society through technology are very much driven by men and not by women. And what I see is that there seems to be in IP, intellectual property is definitely gendered. Trademarks, the branding, that's the girly thing, and patents, technology, that's the man thing. And obviously, there's a massive pay difference also if you work on trademarks or on patents. I'd say the real big shots in my sector are those guys who work on patents and on patent litigation, and not the people who work on the brand of Coca-Cola or Gardner's. And I see fairly little changes to this, quite frankly. There seems to be this myth that you really need to have a technical background to deal with patents, and that's true if you're a patent attorney, but there are a lot of other shades of opportunities you can pursue where women should take up that opportunity, because technology and patents are really instrumental aspects to drive economic growth, to drive prosperity, to change how we live, how we exist as people. And I'm very concerned that these changes are not enough driven by women. It starts with simple things. I mean, the men who keep programming artificial intelligence are usually white, middle-aged men, and they've started to program AI how they think. And there was quite a bit of debate actually in House of Lords in London, because they thought AI is being programmed in an incredibly impolite manner. Teaching kids just not to be rude. So I think there's a lot where I'm very, very, very concerned that in new tech spaces, we are basically just passing on traditional gender stereotypes while doing fairly little, to be honest, to degender new technologies. And that's an issue. And that should be addressed and it should be changed. Silicon Valley is very young, but it's not very, very gender equal. That's a problem, and I don't see anyone or any particular moves in that respect, and that's not okay, and that should be changed.
Just to follow up, just quickly, you mentioned Silicon Valley, but that suggests that it's not only male-dominated, but it's U.S. male-dominated. When I lived in France, there was Telecom Valley. Aren't they doing anything? Isn't Europe doing anything to counterbalance the tech weight of the U.S.?
The Asians, not the Europeans.
Oh.
When you look at that, I mean, this is not a meeting about patents, but we have assessed global patent leadership in a whole bunch of sectors, and it's a very tough competition between Asia and the United States, and Europe is somewhere out of the window. And yesterday, the World IP Organization released its data. The key patent owners in the world are in Asia and in the United States, and not in Europe. That's a whole different drama, which is currently not my cup of tea.
No, for sure it's different, but that does have a spillover impact on social policy and on political strategy. So.
Yes, for sure. For sure it has. The technology leadership is stemming out of the Republic of Korea, out of China, out of Japan, out of the United States. These are the key hubs. There are some spots of highlights every now and then in the European Union, but patent leadership is not stemming anymore from Europe. That is just a myth. And I'm extremely concerned also that in many of the policy fora around technology, around patents, there's an entire misrepresentation, underrepresentation of women. Definitely in the litigation space, it's tough to be in a litigation when the judge is a man, opposing counsel is a man, your team are only man, and then you are the only woman. It's really tough, because if you're in litigation, people don't make gifts. This is not where people open the door and say, please, after you, because you're a woman. That's a fight. You're in a fight only with men. And these dynamisms need to change. And we see, at least in France, among the judges, there are more women. But in the UK, the patent judges, I can't think right now of a woman judge in patents in the UK. But I need to see, maybe there's someone, but on top of my head, the old guys.
Scary. At some point, maybe Nina Gardner can address that as a lawyer based on your legal background. But now let's turn to the other Nina Hall, who can follow up adeptly, because you're from the Asia part of what Roya was talking about, even if patents are not your specialized area. So it's up to you.
Thank you, Claudia, and to the other panelists. It's great to be here today. And in fact, I wanted to first of all say it's an incredibly important time to be discussing women and their role in politics, and mention something about patents, because just this week, the WTO has been discussing whether or not to waiver patents on the COVID vaccine. And what's interesting is that we also have a new woman at the head of the WTO, the first African and the first woman. And she came out on Monday very diplomatically, not in favor of the patent waiver itself, but in favor of trying to make sure developing countries get access to a vaccine as much as possible. And I was just checking the news before I came on, and Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the WHO, the World Health Organization, has in fact come out in favor, very strongly so, of the patent waiver. It's something I have an interest in my other hat, apart from teaching and being an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, is I work with a think tank called the New Zealand Alternative in New Zealand to push for more progressive foreign policy. And we've been doing a lot of work with a number of other organizations on this vaccine waiver. But I think it's an important and interesting issue to ask about, well, who's championing this? What countries? And unfortunately, my own country, New Zealand, for all that it's heralded as a leader in many issues and on the COVID response in general, has not yet come out clearly in favor of the patent waiver, which was put forward by South Africa and India in October last year, and has about 100 countries, including most leading international organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, UNAIDS are behind this proposal. So I'd be really curious for it on the specific issue of patents, what your thoughts are about that issue precisely. But pulling back to the panel, what I wanted to do with that example was just show, first of all, we have some new women in very senior jobs in leadership, but her role is somewhat circumscribed by what she can do diplomatically. We also have other women stepping into leadership roles. I'm currently in Berlin. And 2 women were just elected last week to the head of Die Linke, the left party, Janina Wissler and Susanne Henning-Welsow. You also have obviously Merkel at the head in Germany. And I think on top of these women in senior positions, we see an ongoing commentary during the COVID pandemic about whether women leaders have been better at handling the pandemic than their male counterparts.
Yes.
And there have been a number of, journalistic commentary on this. There has been some analysis to suggest that during the first wave of the pandemic last year, in May 2020, countries with women in positions of leadership had death rates that were 6 times lower than countries led by men. Women-led countries tended to lock down earlier, had higher rates of testing, and lower absolute COVID cases than pair countries led by men. And there was a study that actually, as I understand, paired those countries so that they were comparable. And I think that's an interesting thing, perhaps, for us to follow up in further conversations. And I'm going to pull back on, I'm going to return to this theme in my talk today. I want to make 3 points in response to some of the questions Claudia asked us in preparation. First of all, I'm going to make the point that women politicians aren't inherently more progressive or more conservative than others. Secondly, that women aren't intrinsically better leaders than men. So pushing back a little bit on some of the essentialist arguments, but that those that do get top positions often exhibit excellent qualities of leadership. And thirdly, that we should be encouraging a more diverse range of women and men in politics. And this gets back to Viviana's point. And that shouldn't just be based on gender, but also thinking about diversity in terms of class, race, indigeneity, and other backgrounds. So first of all, being a woman, I don't think determines what ideology you have, as probably many of the others on the panel would agree, and we've already had some sort of notes of that. We can look to a huge variation just in the US, from Sarah Palin to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez,
Right.
even the difference between Warren and Kamala Harris. I mean, for the
Yes.
American, it's pretty clear. In Germany, Angela Merkel versus we have the co-leader of Alternative for Deutschland, Alice Weidel, who is, you know, on the other end, or the leaders of Die Linke who are left. In my own country, Jacinda Ardern, who's our current prime minister, went up against Judith Collins, who is of the centre right. And we also wouldn't say that being a man determines your politics. I mean, that would be a pretty weird thing to say, right? We have males of all ideological spectrums. So I think it's an important thing to point out. So while we may be seeing more gender diversity and more diversity overall in Biden's cabinet, and also in the EU with EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen, it doesn't necessarily mean those people are going to take a different path or a more progressive or a more, you know, better for women's rights than any before. I think we should be careful about that. And secondly, I'm skeptical of claims that essentialize women or men as inherently better leaders. I think women have had, you know, policies that have been disastrous for their countries and for women within them. I would argue Margaret Thatcher would fall in that category. But we do know, and this is what I think the anecdote I put forward, the data I put forward before, that during COVID, women have been more risk averse and have prized technical scientific knowledge. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand has been heralded around the world as one of the most effective leaders. There were sort of op-eds in the Financial Times saying, you know, arise, Saint Ardern. She won the Harvard Business School Leadership Prize. You know, the Lancet, the well-known UK medical journal, has prized her. And what made her effective? Many people would agree it was her strong and empathetic leadership. So she was able to spell out clear messages, giving people a sense of purpose, but also to connect. So there were examples during Easter where she talked to children and said the Easter bunny was an essential service, and so it would manage to deliver the, you know, your chocolate Easter eggs, even though it was a tricky time.
Right.
And I think there's been, I understand, research that I actually heard a former Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, referring to recently, that suggests in the business realm, good leaders tend to be people who have self-doubt, they have an ability to ask questions, and work well in teams. And these are qualities that women often have, but men can have too. And typically what people associate, certainly in the political and the business realm, with good leadership is things like charisma and confidence. But that doesn't always equate actually with effective leadership. So my sense is we should be promoting these sorts of qualities, obviously self-doubt and good measure, but we shouldn't be promoting confidence to the extent of arrogance. We should be promoting people who can listen and ask good questions. And certainly during times of COVID, that is extremely important. And my third and final point is just that we need to promote many forms of diversity, not just gender. And I think, you know, sometimes obviously we're here to talk about women and celebrate women's contribution, and I certainly want to do that. But I think there's an increasing awareness, be it from the Black Lives Matter movement, but also decades long of work of people like, and hold up Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider, a great book, talking about intersectionality and the role that sexuality, being lesbian, being Black, plays in people's lives. And I want to give two examples to finish up of how people can bring much more than their gender to a role. The first is Linda Thomas Greenfield. I think she's a really good example of this. She's Biden's US permanent representative to the UN, an African-American career diplomat who has worked for 35 years in the Foreign Service. And she's not the first African-American woman to hold this role. In fact, They've all been women, her predecessors, but we've had Susan Rice, another African-American, hold it. And then other white women, Nikki Haley, Samantha Power, Kelly Craft. But she's what I think makes her an interesting candidate is she's the first in her family to graduate from high school. And she joined the Foreign Service when it was, in her words, still very male and very pale. Mm-hmm. She's from Louisiana. She practices gumbo diplomacy. And I think there we'll start to see some contrast with her predecessors, like Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Mm-hmm. She's emphasized the importance of kindness and compassion to make the world a better place. And she set out a very strong agenda before she took this role to diversify the State Department. She's pointed out that only 4 of the 189 US ambassadors are Black. The top 4 ranks of the Foreign Service are whiter today than they were 2 decades ago. Only 10% of people are people of color. This was her writing at the end of last year, just before Biden took office. So it'll be interesting to see in her role as US ambassador to the UN what she can do. She's obviously not in charge of hiring in that role, but she has a strong agenda. And the second and final person I want to point out is New Zealand Foreign Minister, Nanaia Mahuta. Nanaia Mahuta was appointed at the end of last year. She's the first woman to hold that role in New Zealand. She's also the first Māori woman. We haven't had a Māori foreign minister, obviously, before. And she's begun to chart out a new values-based approach to New Zealand, or Aotearoa New Zealand foreign policy. She did this in early February, and she said, as the first Indigenous woman to lead this portfolio, I believe we have a prime opportunity to call on the bicultural values that we have. Values such as manaaki, kindness, or the reciprocity of goodwill. Kaitiaki, being protectors and stewards of our intergenerational well-being. And I could go on, but the point is she's drawing on her indigeneity, her Māori roots and perspectives and values in this position. Now, I should also note there has been some debate about how far this will translate into foreign policy, because the rest of her foreign policy speech was quite traditional in terms of her approach to things like trade and New Zealand's traditional partners like the UK and Australia. But I think the point I'm trying to bring out here is that we should be looking not just at gender, but a range of other factors and promoting diversity at a much, much broader way, and to have a diverse group of women and men who should enter politics and political debates. Thanks.
Right. Lots of food for thought, but I see some people chafing a bit. Nina, American Nina, did you want to address the issue about lawyers in patent or other international fora, and how white they are, how male they are, and how does that affect women who are trying to promulgate women's human rights that might also be for women?
Well, listen, I think Roya brought up some very important points, which those of us who sort of follow these things closely are well aware. I mean, in the tech sector, there is a serious issue. And so I won't belabor that. Also in Hollywood, since you asked what with the realpolitik version, not the Hollywood version, look at how many women directors they are, and the importance of having women's voices in those messages is extremely important. Not only women, going to what Nina said, it's just diverse women and diverse people. I think that's extremely important. From the sector I'm in, so I'm straddling between the legal and what I would call the sustainable finance sector. So in the legal sector, technically, traditionally, women would go into sort of trusts and estates and those kinds of jobs which were 9 to 5. There's not going to be like an emergency, and you don't have to spend all night working on major litigation. Now I think that has changed. You're seeing more women in M&A and those kind of issues, but it's taking a while. You'll still, there's still a huge gap there. Although I'm happy to say, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but you're seeing a lot more women judges. Again, and that can, maybe not for the technical issues that Roya needs them where she needs them to be, but I think that it would be interesting to see a breakdown. In finance, I'll tell you, in the last 15 years or so, where I've sort of migrated into sort of this whole sustainable finance area, as opposed to sort of Wall Street hard finance, where it's mostly male, and you can, male, pale, and stale is what I would say, especially on these boards. But in sustainable finance and the world of social responsible investing, there are so many women who are involved in this field that I would say it's nearly 50-50, which is, mind-blowing. And it's not only women, but we're starting to see, even though finance is really lagging in terms of diversity, but we're starting to see real change. So if you look at the sustainable sort of the what we call the SRIs, the social responsible investors, and the people working in this field, this new field called ESG investing, environmental, social, which is human rights and governance, you see a lot more women in those teams. And I think this is extraordinary, because at the end of the day, what's going to move things is finance. And the more women we have at the top making those kinds of decisions, and they are on environment, human rights, and governance, again, corruption issues or deceit, that is extremely important. So women are making real inroads there. And it's been a wedge issue to change the conversation and to change the typical kinds of people who are going into those fields. So I'm very excited about that. But yeah, we should look at, backgrounds. The new head of TII-CREF, one of the biggest pension funds for teachers, is now a woman who comes from a very, difficult background. So a Black woman who does not come from a position of privilege or privileged parents. And we're seeing that more and more. And there's that empathy factor. It's like, I've been there, and $15 an hour wage. We need something, we need fair wages. We need to fight for minimum wage, all those kinds of issues, which I would say are human rights, labor issues, but writ large. You're seeing them, women really fighting for that, but it's not only women, but women with diverse backgrounds, and people who also, men who come from backgrounds that are not the usual sort of elite university and that kind of thing. So I'm positive there's a lot more work to be done, but I'm liking the trends I'm seeing.
And talking about diversity, back to an earlier question to Viviana, diversity in the Middle East in terms of the way women are approaching politics. I'm thinking contrast Israel. I read recently, this morning, that United Arab Emirates, there's a high concentration of women in parliament. One of the highest in the world. Which
quota though?
But sorry.
So yeah, no, but to address that and that compared to Israel, I don't know how it ranks or what it really means. And then I'll add something about my observations in Tunisia some time ago when the stats were also good but were not meaningful. So
yeah. I wanted to, if you allow me, I just wanted to make a point about what I've heard before, not to, I think it's important not to forget the conservative women too, because, a lot of women are also conservative.
Exactly.
And we've been talking about women, I think, as, even though rightly so, Nina Hall pointed out to the fact that there are women of all types, in the US, of all ideologies, in the US, we've seen how white women are quite split, and how some say 55%, some say 45% voted for Trump, and and how many women oppose, conservative women, say Kamala Harris is not my symbol, Amy Coney Barrett is,
right,
the woman who represents me. So we should always remember, that there is that part of the society, that part of women that is quite conservative. And I use that to connect to the Middle East. I actually have written a book about women in the Middle East, not to publicize myself and my, not to advertise my work. It's called Le ragazze di via rivoluzione, because I worked, I've worked on both the Middle East and the US for 15 years that I've been at Corriere della Sera, and I lived in Egypt before, coming back to Italy in 2006. to answer your question, we shouldn't, I'll start from this. In schools, often kids ask me about women in the Middle East, right? Because we have this impression of women in the Middle East, or, you know, also in Pakistan or Afghanistan as victims, right? And I often tell them, remember that Pakistan has had a woman prime minister,
Right.
and Italy has not.
Right.
And that woman was Benazir Bhutto. What does that mean? Well, it means that you cannot only look at gender, you always have to look also at class, especially in these countries. You know, there's a huge gap, you know, in many of these countries, and you know what you can achieve if you have a family and education, a private education very often, and if you don't. Then Pakistan also, though, is the country of Malala Yousafzai, whom I also interviewed and wrote a book about. And you know, and Malala doesn't come from you know, a family of landowners. Her father was the owner of a school for girls, and you know, poets, and you know, and now, you know, he does other things, but it's kind of a middle class family. And it is very interesting that, you know, she wanted to be a doctor, and her dad told her, no, you have to be a politician because we need that. And you know, when she was a kid, even before the Taliban attack and everything, even before she was injured and almost killed. And you know, and this is something very interesting, I think, that traveling across the Middle East, I've come across many stories of women who are changing their societies. You know, we often see them as victims. We portray them as victims, and sometimes this is part of a portrayal that is very ideologized, like, I don't know, ideological, I guess.
Yes.
You know, you want to portray them as victims to say, you know, Muslims are bad. Sometimes, you know, this is, you know, what conservative media do. And definitely there are circumstances in which women are victims, or rather survivors of several different types of discriminations. But I've always been interested, and I've encountered many of these women from Iran, where Nasrin Sotoudeh, the lawyer, the human rights lawyer, is currently in prison for the second time. And she fought for women's rights, but she also fought for kids who are condemned, you know, for people who are in prison for crimes they committed as children, and they risk the death penalty, for political activists, you know, for all different sections of society. I also am interested in conservative women in these societies, because, you know, there are women who say we want a different path than, you know, the Western path. We don't want the same. You know, sometimes they also have a wrong perception of what a Western path to freedom is, you know, because we have misconception about them. I mean, and I'm here generalizing, but they have also misconceptions about us. In Saudi Arabia, I remember having this conversation with a group of women. One of them was an activist who was fighting for the right to drive cars in Saudi Arabia, just a few months before the young prince actually allowed that. Right. And so what happened is that this woman, this activist, had invited a number of women, and many of them were younger than her. She's my age. And some of the younger ones were actually quite conservative. And they were saying, we want separate universities for women and men, because otherwise, you know, the important thing becomes, you know, flirting and things like that. And we want to be focused on our education. And this older woman who had fought for those rights, you know, to have the first mixed education and private, she couldn't believe her. I mean, she knows that there is this strain, but she was protesting. So these women activists, by the way, they ended up in prison. I left Saudi Arabia, and 2 months after, they were imprisoned by the king, the son of the king, even though he allowed them to have the rights to drive and other things. He imprisoned them because what the problem is there is that women shouldn't fight for those rights, and in general, people shouldn't fight. You know, these are rights that should be given from the top, and not people fighting for them, because that is, you know, dangerous. So what is dangerous is not the right itself, but is a vision in which people and women, but not only women, but women were on the forefront of this, are actually so active, you know. So this is also something interesting. And to come back to your point, because here again, we can talk about this for a long time. 2 points I think are interesting. The Emirates that you mentioned. In the Emirates, there might be women in, you know, in certain positions of relative power, because let's not forget that there's a sheikh, and so there are, you know, monarchies, you know, there. But also the Emirates is a country where recently, you might have read in the news, one of the daughters of the
Yes.
sheikh was actually, you know, saying, I'm imprisoned, I can't live, you know, and my sister too, and you know, so it's sometimes interesting how you know, these are also educated women, and so they are the Benazir Bhutto of that country. But a lot depends from family and from education and from, you know, how open or close-minded is sometimes your family, your environment. And another thing that I think is interesting is I spent a lot of time in Pakistan, and there was a very interesting book. I can't remember the title now, but a Pakistani woman who also worked for the World Food Program. She wrote this book about women in her country and in the region, and education, how education is changing things. A lot of women are highly educated now, but sometimes in Pakistan, for instance, and you know, they are educated as a way to get better husbands, you know, richer husbands,
yeah, right.
rather than, and then they, and in any case, they stop when they become mothers, which is the biggest hurdle, you know. So, but it's much more complex, I would say, and it depends in different according to different countries, and within countries you go to cities or rural areas and you find differences, and class is a huge element. And so I mean, so I wrote a book about it, but there are many others that can go more in detail, I believe.
We're coming on to the end of our time, but there's another question that I wanted to throw out to everyone, which some of you have touched on more and some less, but when a woman is a head of state or at a high position, and I'm bringing it back to Italy, Letizia Moratti was mayor of Milan. She was the first woman mayor of Milan, from the right, by the way, so not what one would call a progressive, you know, not an AOC type mayor. But when a woman is in a high position, or the first time in a relatively visible position like that, do more women become involved in politics in that country or in that city or in that region? Did more people, well, Black women voted in modo massiccio for Biden. That's true. But 52%, to answer the question, how many, 52% of white women still voted for Trump in 2020. So it wasn't having a woman on the ticket necessarily energized anyone. So when a woman is head of state or in a highly visible position, maybe for the first time, do more women become involved in politics or not? Question,
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Tell us.
The role model element is very important, folks. I expect a lot of people looking at Kamala Harris and saying, wow, I can now run. I mean, first it was a Hillary Clinton, you know, white woman, but now we're looking, oh my God, you know, woman who looks like me, I can run too. So I think role models are extremely important for women in all sectors. And so I expect a lot more women to be running for, look at the ethnic makeup, the diversity of the Congress, and for the first time also the Senate. It's extraordinary, but the Congress is extremely diverse and getting more and more diverse. So like hats off to the women, conservative and not, who are showing the way.
Any other, the other Nina, are there studies that relate to this? Maybe
Sure. Unfortunately, I can't cite a study off the top of my head. I'd love to be able to, but I can say anecdotally, I know that the New Zealand Parliament right now is the most diverse parliament that we've had, both in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity. We have a number of Māori members of parliament. We have LGBT members of parliament. The Greens caucus, the Green Party, is particularly diverse. So we are seeing that now. I haven't seen any studies that said it's because Jacinda Ardern was the Prime Minister, and obviously we've had previous women. She's the third Prime Minister we've had, but I do think that there's a very clear role in signalling, and not just at the top leadership. It can be, you know, getting into Parliament. It can be all the different positions within politics. So I would just encourage on Women's Day to celebrate, you know, people that you admire and respect in all sorts of different positions, whether it be on a board of a government or of a university, or a lawyer or a judge, because I think it's all very, very important. Yeah.
Getting back to Roya and the absence of women in patents as opposed to trademarks, I read a study, or I looked at a study this morning that suggested that role models for women and innovation benchmarks for women encourages them to get more into the inventing and creation area, and therefore that spills off into doing this. Are there any activities you know of that are encouraging women to do it? Especially when you talked about AI, I was thinking, oh my God, we're going to be run by AI in the future. And if it's all done by middle-aged white guys from the United States and Korea, maybe that's not such a good thing.
Well, UK Parliament thought that's not a good thing, and that they initiated laws around this. But I was just thinking, I mean, there's the International Inventors Association in Geneva, and we launched together with them an International Women Inventors Forum. It was quite fun to do this, actually. So that there are starting points about this going in that direction. I was just thinking something else, however, when I was with SAIS Business School in Oxford, I was in the Center for Professional Service Firms, which dealt with the business of law. And the center did a study, I think, was it maybe even together with some other university, where they asked the question, why are there so few women partners in law firms in the United States? And they did a systematic study. They had panel data from many, many law firms. And they figured that the reason why there are not enough women partners in law firms in the US was not that women work less or they want to have babies and so on or whatever. A main factor was that really that when it came to inheriting clients or getting client introductions, men were always more inclined to pass on clients to men and to bypass women. So the opportunity to really inherit the client or step in the foot of someone else is massively reduced for women. And this is data from the US, I think a very modern country, not from some country rather considered backward. And it's contemporary data, not from the 19th century. I think we have somewhere a video on this from SAIS this summer. It's really, really insightful and absolutely disappointing.
And actually even more frightening than I thought. We're just over time, but we started a few minutes late. So Nina, New Zealand Nina, you want to wrap up too? So the other three have made some comments. Is there any observation you'd like to make on this or other?
Oh no, I feel like I had my good 2 cents, but I don't know if Viviana, she didn't get it.
I'll be very fast because talking about about this is the moment when my daughter is just coming back home. So, but one of the things that I was thinking about is, in the US in 1992, that was dubbed the Year of the Woman, because there was a big jump in the women who entered the house for the first time, right? And when people were looking for an explanation of why that happened, I thought it was interesting that in Congress in general, not just in the House, that there were definitely a large number of open seats due to redistricting redistricting, but there was also probably a big backlash from the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings. Women were upset, and they run in higher numbers, and that we've seen that with Trump too in 2018, and many people have written about that the big increase was due to this backlash against Trump. I think that what is important is that to continue this, there should be, I liked what Nina said about the idea of what makes a good leader, because I think that women for a long time haven't thought about participating in politics or in other fields because they didn't like the idea of competing in certain fields, because sometimes the ideas of what constitutes a good leader is built around, sculpted around the idea of what is a man leader. And I think that we should think about leadership independently on a backlash against somebody, and just, work on that, even in times when we have people we don't dislike in power.
Right. Okay. Which is a theme that's been touched on before. That's really, women shouldn't necessarily be better than men, but just give us the opportunity to be as good. And I've had women politicians in Italy say they didn't believe in the quota rosa, which is a quota for women, but they were wooed to it because they said without that, women would always have to be Superwoman or Wonder Woman to be able to be elected. And that's not fair, because women should be able to be as good as men. But why do they have to be all look like Wonder Woman, which we can't anyway? So that's, that would be the goal, is to make the level playing field for everyone. Because we've run out of time, a great conversation, but we've run out of time. If there are questions when people are watching this later on, please write to the address that's on the Facebook page, and we will get it to the right person, and maybe they can get back and respond to you, because we just didn't have time in an hour. But thank you very much, ladies. It's been wonderful. Great way to celebrate the International Day of Women, and Women's History Month also is this month. So thanks an awful lot, and hope to work with you again soon. Ciao.
Thanks for doing this, Claudia.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.